Scott Strand is one of those people who makes a difference. Scott Strand is the executive director of the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. That's a mouthful. At the end of the day, you have worked with legislation, you work to create laws to protect the environment in the state of Minnesota. So first, thank you, my friend.
Well, thank you, Nancy, and thanks for having me.
One of the things that we had discussed, and I know it's been good news, not all the good news we wanted, but good news, is that with a Democratic governor, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate here in Minnesota, for the first time in years, the environment started to get some attention, started to get some money, and might be on the upside instead of the attack side.
Well, that's right, Nancy. This was really the first, probably the best legislative session we've had in at least 6-7 years, maybe a decade, with the exception of maybe the Next Generation Energy Act back in 2007 when we first set our renewable energy standards. We really had done nothing since then except play defense, trying to keep some of our basic environmental safeguards in place. This year we were able to go back on offense and we were able to get a lot accomplished, both in terms of clean water, standards for clean water planning, and in terms of energy. We have a solar standard now in Minnesota for the first time, which is going to take our fledgling solar industry here and really put it on a solid footing so that as that price of solar comes down and it becomes more competitive with traditional ways of producing electricity, our Minnesota businesses will be ready to take advantage.
Scott, a lot of us had hoped that we would see a great deal more progress on solar energy, on alternative energy. You were the first to say we might not have gotten as much as we want, but we got a start. Can you explain to us what that start is? What have we to rejoice about?
Well, the main thing on the energy side is what we've done to facilitate solar energy in this state. People don't think that solar energy makes a lot of sense in Minnesota because it's cold, it's cloudy, but the fact is that we have some of the best solar resources in the country, and in fact we do about the same as New Jersey, and New Jersey has about 100 times as much solar energy as we do.
Oh my goodness.
Why? Because they've made some policy decisions that they're going to encourage solar energy. And we're just trying to bring Minnesota, in line with states like New Jersey, with countries like Germany, who've been the leaders in the world on these particular sets of issues. It's not as everything that we asked for. We got a 1.5%, 1.5% of our electricity will have to come from solar by the end of the decade. We were shooting for 4%, but it's something that the solar industry tells us will give them the economic confidence that they need to attract lenders, to attract credit, to be able to do the financing to get underway, and that's what we were trying to accomplish.
I know another thing that you have worked so diligently on, and as you've suggested have been in the posture of defense for a very long time, is our Minnesota waters. We in Minnesota care about as much as about our waters as much as I would guess anybody in the country. We care about our lakes and our rivers, and we put it on our license plates, and there's a stunning number. Is it 4 out of 10 bodies of water in the state of Minnesota are below health standards?
That's right, 40%, nearly half.
That's frightening. Why? What has happened? What have we done?
Well, the main problem over the last 20 years has been what we call non-point water pollution. We've done a pretty good job of dealing with the traditional kinds of water pollution, pipes coming out of factories, pipes coming out of wastewater treatment plants. But what we haven't done a very good job is dealing with really the changes in industrial agriculture. Agricultural runoff, whether it comes over the surface or it comes through what they call the drain tiles, the plumbing sometimes underneath the surface, are doing a lot of damage to our lakes and rivers. And the impairments that we're seeing in both of our main rivers, our major streams, and a lot of our most famous lakes is primarily coming from agriculture. And that's the one issue that we just have not come to grips with.
We're not talking about the little family farm. Much of this is exacerbated because we have now these big corporate farms that really have not had strict environmental standards that they have to live up to.
Well, agriculture was exempted from the Clean Water Act 40 years ago when we first passed the law.
Go figure.
Nobody thought that it was going to be an issue, and obviously agriculture has a very strong lobby. And so we've had to rely, because we don't have that regulatory hook, we've had to rely on a variety of voluntary programs, on incentive programs, on using public dollars sometimes to make the changes in agricultural practices that are necessary in order to protect our waters. What we haven't been doing at all the last few years, though, is doing the right kind of planning. But before you can target your scarce public dollars, you have to know what you're doing. You have to do the science, you have to identify the sources of the pollution, you have to make clear determinations about where you can best apply those resources, and we just haven't been doing that. We've been doing very vague kind of studies to avoid, I think, offending anybody or pointing the finger at anybody. So we'll see reports that'll say the pollution is coming from somewhere upstream. Well, it doesn't take a lot of science in order to come up with that conclusion. Usually water does flow downhill. And now we did get some standards finally this past legislative session that will lay out some markers for what those cleanup plans are going to have to include. And we're confident that it's going to make an enormous difference so that we can take the money we have from the legacy amendment, which the voters passed, the other resources that we get, and some of the voluntary best management practices that we can encourage. If we can get all those things working in a way that's targeted to where the greatest need is, we can make some progress. We can take some of those polluted waters and put them back on the clean list.
I know that the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy is nonpartisan.
Right.
We here at Democratic Visions are not. So I'll go ahead and say it. You didn't move forward, as you've already suggested to us, since '06 until you had a Democratic governor, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate here in the state of Minnesota. So I'll thank us on my behalf for that. Having said that, the governor and the legislature, in great part because of your pushing these issues, has put together something called the Environmental Quality Board. I know you're very happy about this. Tell us what it is.
Well, the Environmental Quality Board is an agency that we've had in state government for nearly 40 years. It's an overarching board that's composed of the commissioners, the top level officials in most of the cabinet departments, plus a group of private citizens that are appointed by the governor. And this board has, since the early 1970s, had the responsibility of coordinating all the environmental efforts of all of the various agencies. You know, Minnesota has a lot of very strong environmental laws, and Lord knows we've got hundreds of units of government that have some role to play in enforcing them. We've got the Pollution Control Agency and the DNR and the Board of Water and Soil Resources and the Health Department and the Commerce Department and the Public Utilities Commission and watershed districts and watershed management organizations and soil and water conservation districts.
Makes you want to take a nap, doesn't it?
It does.
Oh my golly.
And it's a source of incredible frustration for people, all
bet.
of those different units of government. And it's been very important for there to be some kind of a coordinating body where ultimate policy decisions are going to be made so that all those different agencies can be rowing the boat in the same direction. But for the last 20, 25 years, that agency has largely not had any kind of support. Its budget has been cut to virtually zero. It was down to under a full-time person as a staffer. It really had no capability of performing any of its basic functions. Particularly in the Carlson, the Ventura, and the Pawlenty administrations, it really took a series of cuts, and it was very close to being abolished altogether.
Goodness sakes.
This administration, though, has decided to reverse course and has, I think, made a very strong commitment towards revitalizing the Environmental Quality Board and using it as a way to really set an administration environmental agenda and to get all of its agencies, again, focusing on a couple of very important issues where we need all the agencies working together to make some progress.
That makes so much sense because, of course, if you have any wherewithal to try to do something properly, first you have to know how you're going to do it or else you're just bumping into each other all the time.
Well, that's right. And when you think about the environmental issues that we have, the major ones, none of them can be given to one agency to deal with.
Of course not.
So if we're talking about climate change, mitigation, adaptation, it's not just the regulations that the Pollution Control Agency has, but it's what are we doing on transit? What are we doing in regulating our electric utilities? What are we doing in terms of land use? What are we doing in terms of the way we use our water? All of those are things that are affected by climate change. And if you have agencies going off at cross purposes, you're going to accomplish exactly nothing. If you get all the agencies going in the same direction, along with the local units of government, then you have a chance of making some very real progress. And that's where the EQB, the Environmental Quality Board, with the strong support of the governor's office, can, I think, really make a difference.
There's an environmental congress here in Minnesota. What does it do? When is it? Where is it?
The law has required that there be an environmental congress, a meeting of public citizens with the units of government in order to discuss environmental issues. It's supposed to be every single year. We haven't had one in about a decade, but we did have one this past February. right here in Bloomington, and it followed a series of environmental forums that were held all across the state of Minnesota, with I think the largest one, again, being here in Bloomington over at Normandale Community College. And I think in just about every single circumstance, the number of attendees was some 3 or 4 times what we were expecting. I mean, there were literally thousands of people who came to the environmental forums around the state.
Isn't that wonderful?
And several hundred people attended the Environmental Congress. I think it sent a very powerful message to the governor that environment needs to move up on the list of items on the agenda. And I think really the fact that those forums and the Congress were so successful is why we're seeing a revitalized Environmental Quality Board now.
People often say, well, I'm just one voice. My phone call doesn't matter. My text doesn't matter. People have no idea how loud that one voice can be.
That's exactly right. I mean, the world belongs to the people who show up, and people showed up for these environmental meetings. And again, sent that clear message that environment matters. And it wasn't just the governor, but it was each of the members of his cabinet. They all went to these forums. Everybody that was a member of the Environmental Quality Board, the Pollution Control Commissioner, the DNR Commissioner, on and on, they were all there for all of them. And they saw the passion that was there, and they communicated that back.
Climate change is a big issue in the legislature.
They were able to use survey methods to find out which issues people were most concerned about. Not surprisingly, the 2 issues they were most concerned about were climate change and water, what you'd expect. And sure enough, the first 2 issues that the new EQB is going to focus on are going to be climate change and water.
Isn't that wonderful?
It is very positive because it's, it could just be another sort of bureaucratic shuffling of the deck, and it would be in some other administrations. But in this administration, I think they're sending a very strong signal that they do intend to make environment a priority. The governor's office and the top management in these state agencies have to make this work. They have to want to make it work for it to be successful. And right now they're demonstrating that they really do. And that's something we have not seen in a generation. And it's something that Minnesota desperately needs if we're really going to come up with solutions that match the scale of the problems that we currently face.
And again, Minnesotans have long been on record saying, I care about this place. And we proved it when we went to the polls several years ago and approved the legacy amendment, which said, sure, raise my taxes just a little bit so that that little bit goes to help the environment and save it. We care.
That's right. And people from around the country continue to be amazed at the fact that Minnesota was able to pass the legacy amendment. And to do it in 2008 when we were diving into the recession.
Right.
People said, even though my finances are starting to fall apart, I'm willing to be taxed more because I care about these fundamental Minnesota resources. That's a powerful message too. That legacy amendment had the best results of anything on the ballot. There isn't any candidate that ran statewide that year that had a better outcome than the legacy amendment did. It was bipartisan. Lots of Republicans, lots of Democrats. It was very Minnesotan. And I think that Minnesota focus on environmental issues is part of what makes us distinct as a state. And frankly, I think it's part of why we remain competitive economically. People now make decisions about where they're going to put their businesses based on not how low the taxes are or how low the workers' comp premiums are, but on what the quality of life is.
And it's because of people like you and all of your folks at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy that they continue to be convinced that it's in their own best interest to follow the light of taking care of the environment. We thank you, Scott Strand, and the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy very, very much.
Thank you for having us.
Democratic Visions is handcrafted by volunteers through DFL Senate District 48, Eden Prairie, and Minnetonka. Sharon Maureen, Chair.